Good afternoon. Welcome to another live stream chat sponsored by The Record, NorthJersey.com, and the USA Today Network. I'm Mike Kelly. Today we're talking with U.S. Senator Robert Menendez, a Democrat from New Jersey, who is joining us from his office in Washington. Mr. Menendez has served in the U.S. Senate since 2006, but he began his public career in 1974 at age 20, when he was elected to the Union City School Board. From there, he became Union City's mayor, then a state assemblyman, then a state senator, then a U.S. congressman, and now U.S. senator. He is now the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the highest ranking Latino American in Congress. Good afternoon, Senator. Thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon, Mike. Good to be with you and your viewers.
Yeah, I'd like to begin, Senator, with the news that's really dominated the nation in the last 2 weeks. And I'm talking about the death of George Floyd at the hands of police in Minneapolis. And in particular, the calls now for police reform, both in Congress and at the state legislative level in many states, and also at local levels. And what I found striking about your resume is that you've served in all those levels of government. And I'd just like your take as a former mayor, a state legislator, and now a member of Congress. Where do you see this effort going for police reform?
Well, I think the nation is crying out for reform. And I think the legislation put forward by my colleagues, Cory Booker, my colleague from New Jersey, who is leading this effort along with Kamala Harris of California and others, gets to the heart of some of the fundamental changes we have to make, the Justice and Policing Act of 2020.
Which you are a co-sponsor of.
I am a co-sponsor of it, looked at it hard, and I believe that reform is necessary. And this helps to prevent police misconduct in the first place by both increasing data and transparency, as well as modifications to training and practices. It bans the use of chokeholds. It ultimately creates a grant program for state attorney generals to create an independent investigation for the process of law enforcement misconduct or excessive use of force. It limits the transfer of military type weapons to police departments. It makes lynching a federal crime. These, I think, are responsive to the tragedy of Mr. Floyd and others, and can transform, just like the Civil Rights Act did, just like the Voting Rights Act did, can transform the country to a better place.
Where do you stand on the whole question of, there's been a lot of talk about defunding police forces. Do you see that as a legitimate reform effort, or do you see another way here?
Well, I understand the sentiment behind it, but obviously we need law enforcement entities. And let me just say, overwhelmingly, police officers do a great job. They risk their lives. And when you're in danger and you call 911, you're hoping that officer gets there right away. So I lose sight of that. But like anything in large entities, there will be those who are bad actors, who use beyond their legal authority, their ultimate authority, when either they use their weapon, or in the case of a chokehold or asphyxiating someone, that make it difficult for all the good officers that are out there. And so the reform that I'm talking about is one that seeks to transform our police departments. And look, Camden, New Jersey is a great example of how you can transform a police department into one that the community embraces, feels respect for, and is willing to share information with in order to keep safety in their community.
Sure. As we all know, though, so much of reforming a police department, it's a kind of mix of local politics with maybe a little bit of state politics thrown in. And of course, there are major issues with police unions as being impediments to reform. Where do you see Congress's role in all of this?
Well, I see it by creating national standards so that, for example, one of the elements of the Justice and Policing Act is to create a national registry base. Right. So if you get convicted of misconduct in New Jersey, You can't go ahead and apply in Minnesota and get a job there because misconduct is misconduct. I think that's an important tool. And look, even my Republican colleagues understand the demands. Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, the only African American senator, Republican senator, is now drafting a bill. I doubt his bill will go as far as Senator Booker's and Harris's, but the mere fact that they are in the midst of drafting a bill as a member of the majority party, I think, in the Senate, that is, speaks volumes about the urgency for reform. And I think this is a moment fueled by Americans of all backgrounds and races who want to see reform. And I think that drives the impetus. And I will say and applaud those police chiefs and departments who have actually been at the forefront of saying that some things need to be changed. And I would say to them the same thing that I say to some of the businesses when we're dealing, with issues in the Senate. Either be part of the change and the reform, or you will face a change and reform you won't like. And so I would urge him to actually embrace some of the efforts.
It's interesting you mentioned the Republicans. There has such a divide in Congress, and I don't need to remind you of that. I'm sure you're aware of it on a daily basis. Do you see a bipartisan effort coming together here for police reform, or I guess what I'm asking is how far along are we on that kind of thing? I know there's been a tremendous outpouring of Democratic support for a police reform bill, with many Democrats getting behind the Justice in Policing Act that Senator Booker has proposed and that you have co-sponsored. And there's an enormous effort in the House, the Democratic-controlled House. But where do you see the Senate in terms of a bipartisan effort to get behind a solid police reform bill?
Well, I would hope that we would have a bipartisan effort. I mean, I've succeeded at some of the most important legislation becoming law by reaching out to Republican colleagues and finding common ground. I know Cory Booker did that when he championed criminal justice reform. Everybody told him can't be done. And he got a good chunk of what he was looking for, working with many on the Republican side. This is not a Republican or Democratic issue. It should be one that unites the nation and transforms it. So I hope that when Tim Scott puts forward his legislation, we'll look at it. I know that Senator Booker has been talking to Republican colleagues in an effort to make this bipartisan. We would welcome a bipartisan effort. We think it would be healing for the nation, transformative, but also it has to be substantive. It cannot be a sugarcoating and say, okay, we've done
Sure.
something.
Sure. Just one final question on this. I'm wondering how many Republicans are now on board with some kind of police reform legislation in the U.S. Senate. Can you give me an estimate on that?
Oh, it's too early to tell because, Senator Booker's legislation was just introduced the other day. Today's news stories bring that Senator Scott is drafting his own bill. But I am sure Senator Scott wouldn't be drafting his own bill without some green light from his party to do something. So I will look that as a positive result and hope that we can come to common ground on legislation. But this will depend. The answer to your question, Mike, depends upon the American people. Adlai Stevenson said it best. When I get the heat at home, I see the light in Washington.
Right.
If people don't see this happen, then they'll generate the heat to see the light in Washington.
I guess in a general sense, Senator, and I'd love your sense on this, is the heat being turned up? I mean, is this what, there's a lot of talk among, people like me or writing columns that this is a turning point. Do you see this as a turning point in our nation?
I do. I really get the sense, seeing some of the email traffic we are getting from back home,
Really?
seeing the calls we're getting from back home. Overwhelmingly, they are in support of creating change. And, as I look at some of the backgrounds, they're diverse. And so I think that the nation has moved in a direction in which they will just not go by quietly unless they see real change. And that's what happened during the civil rights movement. There came a moment in time during the voting rights effort. There came a moment in time in which it was ripe for action. I believe this is one of those transformative moments.
Interesting. I wonder if I could switch subjects here and also bring up the bipartisan question yet again. I'd like to talk about your proposed legislation for the next stimulus bill in our to alleviate some of the economic issues facing people as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. And your bill, I believe you call it the SMART Act, would essentially seek to provide about $500 billion for state and local governments that have been really cash strapped because of the lack of tax revenues coming in because of the pause in the economy. Where is that bill right now?
Well, Mike, the SMART Act, which is the state and municipal assistance, is bipartisan. I introduced it with Senator Bill Cassidy, a Republican from Louisiana.
I know.
A fellow member of the Senate Finance Committee. I introduced it with Susan Collins of Maine. I introduced it with Senator Hyde Smith of Mississippi. And we are building upon that Joe Manchin, who is a more conservative Democrat,
Sure.
as well as Cory Booker. So the bottom line is we start off with a broad bipartisan consensus, both ideologically and geographically. And it is also reflective of the calls, the bipartisan calls we've heard from the National Governors Association, the bipartisan association of all the governors in the nation, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the National League of Cities, the National Association of Counties, police and firefighter unions, and others. And what it does, it's smart because, number one, we need to help our state and municipalities. We had a hearing recently in which it was clearly defined by Moody's Analytics and others that there is about a $500 billion need nationwide for states and municipalities. And we devised it in such a way that we think is the right choice. A third, $166.6 billion, goes to states based on population, including a 45% set aside for municipalities. A third goes based upon infection rates. And as you know, Mike, from your experience in New Jersey, we have the second highest rate of infections and deaths. So that would be very responsive to states like ours. And a third based on revenue losses, and that's being seen across the country. So we think that it will drive a lot of support, and I'm convinced the next COVID-4 bill will include either the SMART bill or a version of the SMART bill and a $500 billion figure.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned about where the money's going. Need I remind you that Mitch McConnell, the Senate president, Republican, has referred to some of this legislation. I don't know if he's referred to the SMART Act specifically this way, but he's referred to it as a blue state bailout, and that he would not be in favor of that. Do you think, given your coalition that you've been able to put together of Republicans and Democrats, that you have moved McConnell off of that position?
I think so. Look, first of all, Mitch McConnell said the state should go into bankruptcy if they had to. Which
right. Is illegal. I was going to mention that as well.
Which is both illegal as well as, just not realistic. He's gotten off of that. Then he said there wasn't going to be any monies. Now he says there will be some. I don't think Mississippi, Maine, and, Louisiana are necessarily blue states by way of example.
Sure, I agree.
I'd say to Mitch McConnell and to my other colleagues, hey, Kentucky gets billions. I think it's 20 some odd billion dollars more than they contribute to the federal treasury every year. Well, then give back the money that you get more than what you contributed, and I'm sure we would be fine not to contribute the extra 18 billion that New Jersey contributes than what it gets. So, at the end of the day, it's ridiculous to take those views. A national emergency needs a national response, and that's what we're doing on a bipartisan basis.
Do you think what do you see as the schedule for this, Senator? When do you think we might actually see a bill on the floor of the Senate, and then perhaps a vote, and then on the presidency?
I think in July. We're headed a couple of weeks more in June, based on the schedule the majority leader has put out. I can't see us getting there, although I would like to. The House has already moved their version. And while it's more expansive, at least there's a foundation there to work with. I think that after we come back from the 4th of July recess, it would seem to me that that will be a propitious time, because states like New Jersey have constitutional balanced budget provisions. They don't have choices. And the height of the irony of this pandemic would be that those who we've needed the most, firefighters, emergency management, police, hospital personnel, teachers, would be the ones who would be laid off as a result of the consequences economically of the pandemic's results.
So we're looking at July, perhaps, for this bill.
I believe so.
I wanted to switch a related topic to the coronavirus, and that is there is a lot of talk about the fact that we need some kind of national, or at least federally supported effort to test for coronavirus, and also to do some contact tracing. Is there support for that in the Senate?
I believe so. And as a matter of fact, well, let me use your question just to make the case for the moment. The president wants to reopen the economy. All of us want to reopen the economy, but
Sure.
we want to get, open an economy and get back to some normal. It won't be the same normal, but some normal. And the only way to do that and to drive our economy, which is based upon consumer demand, is to say to the average New Jersey and the average American, your trip to the store, to the mall, to the restaurant, to the public square has been made much safer, that the risk of contracting the virus has been largely mitigated as a result of testing and contact tracing. Until we do that, all the money in the world won't solve our problems. So this is a big part. That's why we got in the last version of the legislation that became law, $25 billion towards testing and contact tracing. I'm glad to see Governor Murphy has been very vigorous in this. We have several hundred sites in New Jersey now to test. I myself finally got tested, and luckily it came out negative. I wanted to go see my grandchildren, but we need everybody to get tested. And then, of course, if there's a positive result, then we need to help that individual get healthy, and we need to know the universe that they were exposed to, which is what contact tracing is all about, so that we can limit the spread of the virus and get back to a new normal. And that's why I think there is support, as is evidenced by the $25 billion that was passed as part of that. We need to build upon that and have a national system, because if a state like New Jersey does a great job, but people from New York and Pennsylvania, I'm just saying by way of example, don't do the same great job, well, we cross each other's boundaries and
Sure.
state lines. So we need to have a national effort.
But do you see the federal government, though, getting involved in actually running this, or do you see it still in the hands of the states? I mean, I agree with you. There's been a lot of testing at the local level. I've also been tested and thankfully came out negative. But do you see the federal government stepping in here in a real way and moving toward a national system of testing?
Well, I do, at least in terms of creating the resources and creating the standards. And if we give the resources, create the standards, and operate them through the states, then we will have the maximum outreach and the safety net of a whole nation at the end of the day we want. Look what's happening right now. There are 19 states that prematurely, on my view, prematurely opened up. And what do you see? You see a rise in their COVID infection rates. That's the world's worst result, because you're going to end up, one of the states, I believe it's Texas, just notify their hospitals to go back into an emergency position. That's not what you need in terms of being able to move towards a new normal.
When do you see Congress moving on this kind of legislation?
I think it will build upon what we did with those $25 billion. The House has a very significant provision in the HEROES Act, and I think that will be also part of whatever the next, what I'll call COVID-4, the next stimulus / health package will be sometime in July as well.
We have less than a minute left, and I just want to ask you a question about the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I know the committee has been trying to get Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to appear before the committee to answer some questions ethical questions about his office. I wonder, do you see him actually appearing before the committee, and are the Republicans on that committee going to take a stand on this?
Well, we've actually asked the secretary to appear before the committee, as every other secretary of every other cabinet office has, to appear before the annual budget. That's
Right.
one of the essential moments. Now, of course, at that point in time, questions on foreign policy issues are raised, and maybe questions about the conduct of the department are raised. But this secretary has been the secretary who has least appeared before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee of any secretary. And I've been doing foreign policy since I was in the House, in 92.
I know.
I've seen this secretary the least of any Secretary of State, Republican or Democrat alike. He owes it to the committee and to the American people to come forth, defend the budget, talk about foreign policy issues across the world. We face a lot of challenges, and if appropriate, yes, answer questions about the conduct of the department.
Well, Senator, thanks so much. I'm glad we could have you on today. I know you've got another meeting to run to, so I'm not going to hold you on any longer. But I want to thank you for appearing, and I hope we can do this again. And for our viewers, thank you for tuning in. If for more information on this program and other news, please tune in to northjersey.com. For the record and northjersey.com, I'm Mike Kelly.